This is Alistair Post Quinn from Falling Blocks Designs, and I'm going to show you how I do a double knit bind off. Now this bind off is going to be reminiscent of the cast on that I use. It's not an invisible bind off, it's just a simple bind off. There are other bind offs to use, but this is one that I use most frequently. What I've just done is a row of all one color order. This color order is AB, it could be BA, it doesn't really matter. And when I got to the end, rather than slipping the last pair as I normally would in a row, I worked the last pair and I broke the ends with just enough tail to weave in. Now, at this point there isn't really enough yarn to do another bind off. That's okay, because the row that I just did actually is my bind off row. So at this point I'm going to take this entire thing and I'm going to slide it to the other end of my needle. Now, if you're on a straight needle, you're going to have to slip back until your needle point is sticking out the wrong end of your work. Or, if you like, if you're working on straights, you can take a circular of the same size or a DPN of the same size, depending on the size of your bind off. And you can just work that last row onto the circular or the DPN and then do what I just did. If you're in the round, you don't have to do any of that. You just work the row and then you're already at the beginning on the other needle. So at this point what I'm going to do is, I clearly can't do anything with these ends, but I'm going to start working these stitches again by slipping them. So I'm going to slip one knitwise, then slip one purlwise, then I'm going to pass one over and off. Slipping one knitwise, over and off. Slip one purlwise, over and off. So I'm slipping all of my knits knitwise, and all of my purls purlwise. And every time I have two on the needle, I pass one over and off. So it's similar to the simplest bind off you know, except that of course it's done in double knitting. But more to the point, it's done by doing the entire row first and then going back to the beginning to do the bind off. So why do I do it this way? Well, first of all, let me pause it here. And I'll show you the beginning of the edge. You can see that it's reminiscent of the cast on, as I mentioned. It's got a little peak of the other color, just like the cast on does, and the same on the other side. It's got a nice amount of stretch to it, similar to the cast on. So let's go to this side. I'm going to continue this in a moment, but let me explain why I do it this way. These two stitches are the most recent stitches done in double knitting. At any given time, the two most recent stitches done are connected to the two source yarn balls, which means that they'll stretch out like this. So if I were to take this stitch and try to pass it over this one and off, as I would if my needle point were here, it stretches. And if I continue the movement, which I can't right here because there is no needle point, then this would end up around this stitch and off the needle, and I would then have to tighten it back into place, and it would be tightened around the base of this stitch, and then that would be repeated and repeated as I finished the bind off. The problem with that is that every time I tighten it, I'm manually adjusting the tension of my bind off, which means that in all likelihood I'm either going to end up with too loose, too tight, or just an uneven bind off. So let's then go a little further back. Imagine that the purls were not there, and I was just looking at a single layer piece of knitting. In that case, I would be taking this stitch and passing it over this stitch and off. And if I do that, if I tug on this, it doesn't move very much, but if I tug harder, it does actually steal yarn out of this stitch and therefore the source yarn ball. So let's go back a little further. If I take this stitch and try to pull it, again imagining that the purls aren't there, if I try to pull on this, there isn't much that I can do to pull on this unless my yarn is very slippery, which will steal any significant amount of yarn out of both this stitch and therefore the source yarn balls. So the further back you go, the less likely it is that any stitch that you pull on will change in shape as you pull it over and off. So that's what I've done. I've gone all the way to the beginning. I'm working with stitches that are all exactly the same size and shape. And so therefore my bind off ends up being perfectly clean and even. Now, if you're finding at this point, midway through it, that it isn't quite what you're looking for, if it's too stretchy, for example, you could undo what you've done, undo the last row, and redo it on a needle size down. Ideally, at that point, you would have wanted not to have broken your ends, because you might want to use more yarn. You shouldn't on a needle size down, but if it's not stretchy enough, you might want to go a needle size up, in which case you might need to use a little more yarn. Either way, you can adjust it so that the tension and the stretch is exactly what you need. So, I'm going to continue this and I'll show you how it ends. Just going to do a little fast forward here. So here I am at the end of my bind off, and I'm going to slip one last stitch, and that takes this needle out. Now I'm not going to pass this over and off. I'm going to go until I have one last pair on the needle. Everything in double knitting is done in pairs. And you'll notice that I can pull these in and out. If you find these two stitches don't stretch out like this, it means that you slipped the last pair rather than working it. That's a fairly common mistake. But it's very easy to fix too, because your ends are right here where you need them. All you need to do is undo this last PSSO, work a regular double knit pair, redo the last PSSO, and then you're back in business. So at this point, I'm going to reach through both loops, grab both ends, pass both ends together through both loops. At this point I can remove the other needle and tighten. So there's the finished bind off. And here's a good example of how stretchy it is. So I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you very much for checking it out. If you're interested in seeing more double knitting videos, continue to follow this channel. Visit my website, double-knitting.com, to look for workshops that I teach online. And also, if you're so inclined, check out my Patreon. One of the tiers will give you access to more advanced double knitting videos, which will be exclusive on Patreon for some time. It will eventually probably end up on YouTube, but it's going to be a while. I will be adding more basic techniques here on YouTube, so stay tuned. Again, this is Alistair Post-Quinn for Falling Blocks Designs.